Okay, let's unpack this.
I'm ready. This was a deep dive into, well, the absolute maximum of human ambition.
Human ambition versus
Okay.
what? Physics, logistics.
Exactly. Constrained entirely
Right.
by physics, logistics, and, a potentially infinite appetite for capital expenditure.
Right. And the big question we're wrestling with today is, can the exponential, frankly, aggressive pace of AI scaling actually continue through 2030?
Or are we about to slam face first into a wall? A wall made of silicon, power lines, and maybe just data dust.
It really feels like we're living through a massive bubble. But the question is, will physics burst it, or will the economics just inflate it even further?
And for that, we analyzed some very intense, really hard-nosed research. These are sources that aggressively model the limits of AI growth.
And they're basing it on 4 key sort of unavoidable bottlenecks.
That's right. Power, chip manufacturing, data, and latency.
Right.
They've really investigated whether this pace of scaling, this 4x annual growth rate, is it physically or logistically doomed?
So our mission here is to synthesize these hard numbers, these constraints. We want to figure out what scale is actually feasible by the end of this decade.
And maybe more importantly, what staggering requirements that level of expansion demands from, the global economy.
Because this isn't just about faster code anymore. This is about infrastructure on a national scale.
Absolutely. And to even start, we have to establish just how absurd the current trend is. For the last several years, AI training compute has been expanding at a rate of approximately 4x per year.
A 4x annual growth rate. It's not just fast. When you loom out and look at it historically, it's basically unprecedented among modern technological expansions.
Right. And when we talk about compute, we need to be clear. We're fundamentally measuring FLP.
Floating point operation.
Exactly. The total amount of computational work it takes to train one of these huge foundational models. And that work has quadrupled year after year.
Our sources actually point out that this 4x rate surpasses the peak growth rates of other major, world-changing technologies.
And that's a crucial piece of context, I think. We tend to think of the biggest tech revolutions as happening incredibly fast. But AI is just, it's on another level.
Think about it. Mobile phone adoption, which completely changed society, right? It peaked at about 2x per year.
2x, between 1980 and 1987.
And then you have something like human genome sequencing, the poster child for exponential technological progress.
Right, costs plummeting, speed increasing.
That peaked at 3.3x per year, and that was between 2008 and 2015.
And AI scaling is currently running hotter than both of those. This 4x exponential growth is, it's basically trying to challenge reality.
Which is exactly why we need to dig in and see which real-world constraints are eventually going to win out.
Okay, let's do it.
So let's set the stage for 2030. If this 4x annual growth rate, this, relentless exponential curve, actually continues for the next 6 years, where does that put us?
It puts us at a pretty aspirational scale-up target. The sources say a 2E29 FLOP training run by the end of 2030.
2E29. So that's 2 times 10 to the power of 29 floating point operations.
Yeah. It's one of those numbers that's just so big it's hard to grasp.
So let's give it some context. For you listening, this target represents approximately a 10,000x increase in scale from today's most advanced models.
Like the training run for something like GPT-4.
Exactly. A 10,000 times increase.
And that 10,000x multiplier, it isn't just a random estimate. It's based on observed patterns of these big technological leaps. It's roughly analogous to the difference in capability between GPT-2.
Which came out in 2019.
Right, with its pretty rudimentary text generation and the sophisticated, almost general-purpose problem-solving we see in GPT-4 today.
So the 2030 target suggests we could see models that leapfrog GPT-4 by the same immense margin that GPT-4 leapt past GPT-2.
And that capabilities jump is the ultimate payoff. That's the prize.
Okay, so here's the first major insight from the sources, the initial feasibility check. The analysis concludes that reaching 2029 FLOP by 2030 is technically possible.
It is. The physics don't actually stop us. Not yet. The algorithms aren't the limit.
And this is a monumental planet-sized but.
It's a huge but. Success hinges entirely on overcoming these enormous physical and logistical resource constraints.
And on key companies being willing to invest. Truly unprecedented, eye-watering sums of money.
We're talking about committing hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming years just to enable these large-scale training runs.
So the immediate barrier isn't some mathematical breakthrough we're waiting for.
Right.
It's a physical, industrial, and financial challenge. We're not hitting a software limit. We're hitting a planetary resources and manufacturing limit.
Precisely. And this is where we need to set up the four walls,
Yeah.
the four constraints that threaten to break this 4x annual growth trend.
Right, the four key bottlenecks.
Power, chip manufacturing, data scarcity, and what they call the latency wall. And as we analyze them, we'll start to see which one is really the most limiting factor right now.
And what's so fascinating to me here is that it's the physical infrastructure, not just clever algorithms or better software that dictates the near-term future of AI capability.
You can have the perfect architecture, the most brilliant model design.
But if you can't plug it into a 6 gigawatt power source or get your hands on millions of specialized chips, you just stop dead in your tracks.
The sources basically force us to move past this purely digital discussion of AI progress and anchor it squarely in the gritty reality of, thermodynamics, geopolitics, and supply chain logistics.
Okay, so let's start with the one that's causing immediate headaches for pretty much every company trying to scale.
Let's do it. Power.
All right, let's jump straight to what the source material says is the most immediate, the most binding threat: power.
Yep. The sources suggest that power is the constraint most likely to bind first.
Meaning we will run out of available power before we run out of chips or data.
Right. And to really understand why, we have to contextualize the power use we're seeing right now. A good, tangible, recent example is the training run for Meta's Llama 3.1 405B model.
Okay, so that run used a cluster of what, 16,000 H100 GPUs, top-of-the-line chips?
16,000. And that cluster required a total installed power capacity of 27 megawatts just to run that training job.
27 megawatts. And
Yeah.
to put that on a household scale for you, that's equivalent to the average yearly consumption of 23,000 typical U.S. households.
It's a small city's worth of energy.
Dedicated to training one model for several months.
That's already substantial, but the problem is that 10,000x increase in compute scale we need by 2030. If power demand scaled linearly with compute, the numbers get insane. The 2030 run would need 270,000 megawatts.
Which is the size of small countries, basically. Power plants dedicated to one job.
It's not feasible, which thankfully is where efficiency comes in. We don't expect power demand to scale 5,000x along with the compute.
Right. The sources project a combined 24x efficiency improvement by 2030 thanks to three key areas of gains.
And it's really critical to break down that 24x gain because that's what makes the 2029 FLOP target even remotely possible.
Okay, so first up is hardware efficiency. We expect the FLOP per second per watt, so how much computational work you get per unit of energy, to be about 4x better than today's H100s by 2030.
And that's based on pretty solid historical trends. We've seen about a 1.28x annual improvement since 2010. So that 4x is a reasonable projection.
Okay, that's one. What's the second?
The second is a shift in numerical precision. Llama 3.1 used FP16, so 16-bit precision. But the frontier labs are all moving rapidly to standardize on FP8.
8-bit precision.
Yeah. And this shift lets the hardware perform calculations much faster, more efficiently. It gives you roughly a 2x gain in power efficiency. The H100, for instance, literally performs twice as many calculations per second at 8-bit versus 16-bit.
And it's important to note, this isn't some simple trade-off where you just lose all your accuracy.
Not anymore. Modern techniques like mixed precision training have made 8-bit highly viable for these large models. That's why it's a pretty safe bet for a 2x efficiency multiplier.
So the sources aren't expecting a huge leap to something even lower, like FP4.
Not for frontier models, no. That would probably be too unstable right now.
Okay, so we have 4x from hardware, 2x from precision. What's the third factor?
Duration. The length of the training runs. Since 2010, the duration of these runs has increased by about 20% per year.
But there's a limit, right? They won't just train a model for 5 years.
Right, runs won't exceed a year because labs need to constantly pivot to newer hardware, newer algorithms. But by spreading the energy use over what's extrapolated to be a 3x longer training duration by 2030, say 300 plus days.
It effectively makes the total consumption 3x more power efficient on a calendar basis. You're just drawing the power over a longer period.
Exactly, so you multiply those out. 4x hardware efficiency times 2x FP8 efficiency times 3x duration efficiency.
And that gives us the 24x net efficiency improvement by 2030.
Which brings the required power demand way, way down. That 2030 target run, which is 5,000 times larger than Llama 3.1, now requires only about 200 times more power.
Not 5,000 times.
Not 5,000. And the final number is this. A 2E29 FLOP run will require a staggering total installed capacity of about 6 gigawatts.
6 gigawatts. That is the new benchmark for what one major AI company would need for one single state-of-the-art training run.
So now the question becomes, can we actually secure that 6 GW?
Right. And there are two main strategies the sources look at: local power and distributed power.
For local power, you should be thinking of single, immense data center campuses, what
Yeah.
some people are starting to call AI factories.
And we're already seeing some really ambitious plans being discussed, like the rumored Stargate project. They're planning for facilities between 1 to 5 GW by 2030.
And a facility with a sustained 5 GW supply, if you account for all the efficiency gains and a long training duration, could theoretically support that TWE-29 FLOP run.
But a single 5 GW facility, I mean, that would be close to the total projected power demand for all data centers in Northern Virginia today.
And Northern Virginia is the largest data center hub on the planet.
So that just shows you the massive concentration of energy we're talking about.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And that's why the industry is also looking hard at distributed power.
This is the strategy where you spread the training geographically across multiple data centers, tapping into different regional electricity grids.
Right. Google already does this with its global TPU network. It's a proven concept.
And the sources project that the U.S. will have significantly more data center capacity by 2030. It could grow by 50 GW total.
So if you assume the most well-resourced AI company can somehow harness a big chunk of that new capacity, a distributed network could accommodate a demand of anywhere from 2 to 45 GW.
With the median capacity projected around 8 GW.
And 8 gigawatts is technically within striking distance of the 6 gigawatts required for the target.
Okay, so the ability to connect these data centers with high bandwidth fiber probably isn't the constraint, but securing the actual power, that's where you hit the grid obstacle.
This is where the physical world really starts to fight back. Even if these hyper-rich companies are willing to write a blank check for 6 gigabillion of energy, building new power stations or massive new infrastructure isn't a quick procurement cycle.
It's a classic logistics problem that money alone cannot instantly solve.
Exactly. Transmission lines, which are essential for connecting new power plants to these massive data centers, typically take about 10 years to complete.
And that's if they don't face local political resistance or, NIMBism.
And then there are even smaller but crucial components that have devastatingly long lead times. New electrical transformers, which are essential for power distribution, can require up to 2 years for delivery.
2 years.
Yeah, depending on the current global manufacturing backlog. This infrastructure bottleneck creates this profound uncertainty about whether you can scale power supply significantly faster than what the utilities are already projecting.
The speed of the grid is determined by bureaucracy and concrete, not GPU cycles.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, building new power plants is actually, believe it or not, affordable relative to the chip costs. Yeah, the calculation shows that powering a training run with a new natural gas plant, for instance, would only increase the hardware cost by about 20% today. So the decision to build new power is economically rational.
But here's where the scaling trend introduces a really interesting twist. By 2030, the cost structure changes dramatically.
Right. We established that chips are getting 4x more energy efficient, but they're becoming price performant even faster, about 2x every 2 years.
So let's walk through the math there because it's crucial.
Okay, so in 2030, for every dollar you spend on GPUs, you get 8x more FLOP than you do today. But since the power efficiency only improved 4x,
You effectively require twice as much power per dollar you spend on compute.
the net effect is that the cost of power alone will rise from about 20% of hardware costs today to approximately 40% of the cost of the GPUs by 2030.
40%. So the industry is willing to invest in new generation, but those grid-level infrastructure constraints, the long political and logistical lead times for transmission lines, make rapid scaling past utility projections the most critical and likely constraint to bind first.
Okay, so if power is the immediate operational headache, what about the supply chain that creates the demand for all that power in the first place?
That leads us to the second massive wall, the silicon wall. Chip manufacturing capacity.
And this challenge is about producing tens of millions of state-of-the-art AI chips, like H100 equivalents. And the supply chain concentration makes it incredibly difficult.
We're talking about a massive reliance on just a few foundries, primarily TSMC, and key bottlenecks in advanced packaging.
Specifically, CoWoS chip-on-wafer-on-substrate and high-bandwidth memory, HBM.
Right. And for you listening, these advanced packaging techniques are what allow the different parts of the chip to communicate incredibly quickly. And they are incredibly difficult, sensitive, and resource intensive to scale up.
So CoWoS isn't just about making the silicon itself. No, it's about integrating the memory, the HBM, with the compute dies on a single substrate to maximize that data flow. These advanced steps require specialized equipment, clean rooms, highly trained personnel. It makes them a much tighter bottleneck than just printing transistors on a wafer.
So let's quantify the scale of the demand we'd need to sustain that 4x growth rate.
Okay, current shipments are relatively small. We're talking around 650,000 H100s shipped in 2023.
But the 2E29 FLOP target requires around 100 million H100 equivalent GPUs globally by 2030. And that's to sustain the whole ecosystem, right? Accounting for training versus inference and depreciation.
100 million globally. And if you isolate the need for just a single major player trying to do that frontier training run, one lab would need around 20 million H100 equivalent GPUs just to execute that one job.
That requires a vast expansion of production, way beyond current levels.
It does. So what are the production projections? Well, the semiconductor industry is aggressively expanding, fueled by, trillions in capital expenditure worldwide.
So the projections suggest growth between 30% to 100% per year for GPUs, which kind of aligns with the expected scale-ups in CoWoS and HBM opacity.
And when our sources model this out, the median projection suggests that manufacturing capacity will be sufficient for around 100 million H100 equivalents to be dedicated to training.
Which would be enough to support a massive 9029 FLRP training run.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on. 9029 FLIP is nearly 5 times the 2E29 FOP target we need to sustain the 4x growth rate.
It is.
So the median projection suggests that chip manufacturing, while incredibly difficult, might technically keep pace. It could even exceed the demands of the scaling curve.
That's the critical nuance. Provided the supply chain concentration issues are successfully mitigated, capacity looks numerically sufficient on paper.
But that's a big if.
It is. That feasibility range is highly uncertain. The 80% confidence interval is this wild. It ranges from 20 million H100 equivalents on the low end all the way up to 400 million on the high end.
Which corresponds to a range of 1 E29 FLOP to 530 FLOP runs. That wide confidence interval just illustrates the geopolitical risk, doesn't it? And the difficulty of projecting logistics 7 years out.
It absolutely does.
So why don't the sources treat that geopolitical concentration, TSMC's advanced packaging, as a primary constraint, maybe even more severe than power?
That's a fantastic question. The sources address it by focusing on the economic and technical ceiling. Geopolitical risk is definitely there, but the model assumes that market forces and the willingness to spend billions will drive diversification and expansion.
So the core technical limit is the sheer physical capacity to build and operate the advanced packaging infrastructure.
Right, CoWoS and securing HBM memory. The capital expenditure required is staggering, but the intent to spend is clearly there.
The sources have a really interesting hypothetical maximum, which I think highlights the absolute physical constraints perfectly.
Yeah, they do. If TSMC devoted its entire global capacity for its most advanced nodes, 5 millimeters and below solely to GPU production between now and 2030,
the absolute technical limit, based on current wafer supply, would be pushed to 130 to 251 FLOP.
which is a number that's almost certainly unattainable in reality.
Of course, because those nodes are also needed for iPhones and everything else.
But it shows you the immense constraint of current resource allocation. Even dedicating all the world's most advanced silicon production to this one task only gets us about 50 times beyond our target.
So chip manufacturing is physically possible to scale to 2A29 FLOP, but it requires this massive, sustained effort backed by trillions in capital, primarily targeting that packaging bottleneck.
Okay, so we've moved from the immediate operational bottleneck of power and the supply chain bottleneck of silicon. Now we get to the third constraint.
The fuel that runs the whole engine, data scarcity, often called the training data wall.
For years, AI labs have relied primarily on web text data to fuel training. And we have to introduce this concept of the text data wall. It's the moment when scaling your compute becomes inefficient because you just run out of unique, high-quality data to feed the model.
Okay, so where are we now? The current largest data sets are around 15 trillion tokens.
And when you look at the entire indexed web, all the unique, high-quality text available globally, it's estimated to contain around 500 trillion tokens.
That's about 30 times more data than the largest known data sets today, which sounds like a lot.
It sounds like a lot, but not when you consider the scaling rate. And this brings us back to the chinchilla scaling laws.
Right. These laws establish that to maximize performance for a given compute budget, you have to scale data size and model size proportionally.
So if we rely only on that entire 500 trillion token indexed web, scaling in a chinchilla optimal way would only allow for training runs up to about 828 FLLP.
An 828 FLLP is slightly below our 2029 FLLP target.
Precisely. If the current 4x a year compute scaling trend continues, we would run into this definitive text data wall in about 5 years, around 2028.
And after that, any further scaling would require what's called undertraining.
Where you increase the model size, but you just keep feeding it the same data over and over. And that is a highly inefficient use of very expensive compute.
So the industry has to find new data sources. It's not an option, and that's where the multimodal mitigation comes in.
Right, using other data types like image, video, and audio.
And multimodal data can significantly expand that available data pool. While text is super efficient, there is just more physical data out there in the form of media.
For sure. Audio data alone is estimated at 50 to 100 trillion tokens, which is roughly equivalent to the text estimates, but it's not a massive multiplier on its own.
The challenge here, though, is tokenization efficiency, right?
No.
How much valuable knowledge is actually in a token of video versus a token of high-quality text? It's not a one-to-one conversion.
No, it's not. And this is the squishiest part of the entire model. When you account for all modalities, including public and private repositories of images, video, audio, the estimated effective data stocks allow for a massive range.
How massive?
From 1620 to 232, FLOP training runs by 2030.
Wow. That is a staggering 4 orders of magnitude difference in the confidence range. So why is data scarcity identified as the most uncertain bottleneck of the 4?
It's because of these huge unknowns: data quality, proprietary data availability, and that tokenization efficiency you mentioned. If 1 second of video is found to be equivalent to thousands of tokens of high-quality text, the data wall basically disappears.
But if it's found to be equivalent to only 10 tokens, the wall is much, much closer.
Exactly. That uncertainty forces the researchers to maintain this vast confidence range.
And this uncertainty creates a massive incentive for the industry to invest heavily in synthetic data.
Of course, if you run out of natural data, why not just have an AI generate the data you need?
And the sources confirm this. Synthetic data generation could enable scaling indefinitely. It could effectively push the data wall far back, maybe permanently. It's the ultimate game changer for the data constraint.
But data doesn't come free.
Nothing does.
The computational cost of generating that synthetic data is estimated to be roughly similar to the cost of training the resulting model itself.
So you're effectively doubling the compute requirement to achieve the same performance level compared to using natural data.
Right. If the cost of your frontier run goes from $100 billion to $200 billion because you had to generate the data first, that's a massive capital hit.
But given the economic justification we're going to discuss in a bit, that doubled cost might still be worthwhile if it means the scaling train never stops.
It might be. But for the purpose of determining the 2030 limit, the sources stick to the multimodal data estimates. They exclude the speculative, indefinite scaling power of synthetic data.
Which is why data scarcity, while highly uncertain, remains a threat within the next decade if those tokenization efficiencies don't prove to be highly favorable.
Okay, so the final wall, this one is maybe the most fundamental. The latency wall.
The speed limit.
Exactly. It's a fundamental speed limit imposed by physics and network topology. And unlike the other 3, which can kind of be solved with money for power and chips or generation for data, this one is fixed by the speed of light.
It's the inherent speed limit because of the sequential operations that have to happen layer by layer during training, the forward and backward passes.
Even if your hardware is infinitely abundant and cheap, the minimum time required to process batches sets an upper bound on the total FLOP you can achieve within a fixed training duration. Let's say between 2 and 9 months.
To understand the physics, you have to think about a single forward pass. Every layer of a transformer model has to wait for the layer before it to finish processing.
And in a cluster with tens of millions of GPUs spread across acres of data center space, the physical distance between those GPUs imposes an unavoidable communication delay.
Information literally cannot travel faster than the speed of light.
Let's break down the mechanism and the numbers. The core of a large transformer model is all about this sequential processing.
A single transformer layer requires 4 consecutive matrix multiplications in the forward pass.
And then the same logic is repeated for the backward pass, so that's 8 consecutive matrix multiplications. And crucially, synchronization has to happen at the end of each batch. That's when the gradient updates are shared across the whole distributed cluster.
So if you have 20 million GPUs, you need every single one of them to synchronize before the next batch can even start.
We need to talk microseconds here. For local communication within a modern GPU setup, that whole process translates to about 110 microseconds of latency per layer.
And that latency accumulates over hundreds of layers, multiplied by millions of batches in a training run. That's the speed of light delay combined with processing delay.
So the baseline estimates, assuming current hardware and, say, a GPT-4 critical batch size, which is speculated to be around 60 million tokens, suggest that latency constraints cap training runs at around 330 to 132 FLOP.
Okay, so 132 FLOP. That is significantly higher than our 28029 FLOP target.
It is. So unlike power and chips, latency is the least binding constraint today. But it does define the absolute theoretical limit if we ever manage to solve the first two constraints.
And this brings us to the core issue of maximizing computation under this latency wall, the batch size problem.
Right. The constraints on latency and training time become really taut when you reach what's called the critical batch size. That's the minimum amount of data you need to process simultaneously to keep that enormous cluster busy and efficient.
If you try to run too small a batch on too large a cluster, you just spend all your time waiting for synchronization, not actually computing.
And the researchers found that simply increasing the batch size yields diminishing returns to training efficiency past a certain point.
But the analysis does show that if the critical batch size can be scaled aggressively, and this is a speculative assumption, hypothesized to scale as the cube root of model size, this wall gets pushed back significantly, potentially to that 1A32 FLOP number.
So overcoming latency requires pushing two boundaries: radically scaling that critical batch size, which is a fundamental research question, and optimizing the physical network topology to reduce the communication delay.
The speed of light delay.
Exactly. Surpassing that 1E32 FLOP mark would need radical shifts in network topology. We're talking much larger computational pods, drastically reduced communication latencies between them.
And those advancements are currently considered infeasible, or at least very poorly understood engineering challenges for the immediate future.
For now, the latency wall is a high horizon, but it gives us the absolute ceiling defined by physics.
Okay, so we've completed our examination of the four walls: power, silicon, data, and latency. We found that data and latency are less immediate threats.
But power and chip manufacturing are the true logistical choke points.
So now we put them all together. When all four constraints are combined, what's the conclusion?
The analysis concludes that the most binding constraints power, which is limited by grid capacity, and chip manufacturing, limited by advanced packaging restrict, the overall maximum feasible scale to 2029 FLOP by 2030.
And this is a really critical finding, because it confirms that the historical 4x per year scaling trend can continue for at least 6 more years.
Potentially leading to models that exceed GPT-4 in scale to the same degree that GPT-4 exceeded GPT-2.
But only if the massive investment materializes and they manage to basically buy their way past the physical constraints.
Which leads us directly to the cost of scaling. This level of scale requires a cluster that costs hundreds of billions of dollars.
We are moving past the era of venture-backed startups solving this. This is now a capital expenditure race for global industrial titans.
And remember our discussion on power costs. The analysis shows that because chips are becoming price performant faster than they're becoming energy efficient.
Right. The cost of power alone is going to rise to 40% of the cost of the GPUs by 2030.
40%. This makes power procurement a truly high-stakes, capital-intensive venture. It forces AI companies to effectively become major utility and infrastructure developers themselves.
Which raises the crucial strategic question, why? Why would companies be willing to spend hundreds of billions, potentially trillions of dollars on infrastructure fabs, data centers, new power plants, if the technical and physical constraints are so severe?
What is the immense upside? What's the economic justification for this gargantuan accelerated spending?
It all comes down to the staggering potential for economic returns. Specifically from automation, we are talking about automating large portions of the economy.
And to set the scale, global labor compensation is approximately $60 trillion per year.
60 trillion!
If AI can automate even a small fraction of human labor, the potential payoff is just enormous. Investors are looking at a market opportunity that makes all other industries pale in comparison.
The prize isn't just efficiency. The prize is accelerated, exponential economic growth.
And the sources provide a really compelling mathematical illustration of this hyper-aggressive economic drive. They use high-level economic theory to model rational investment behavior.
Yeah, they use something economists call isoelastic utility over consumption, which is heavy academic jargon.
It is. So let's translate it. It essentially means that current decision makers are constantly balancing their desire for consumption now versus having a much, much higher level of consumption later.
Assuming that economic value far in the future is discounted.
Exactly. But the key is that accelerating the future date of massive automation, that moment when AI begins to drive radical economic growth, is worth immense present-day sacrifice.
So they specifically calculated the willingness of the global economy to sacrifice current consumption to hasten the arrival of that massive automation.
And the number is staggering.
What is it?
If AI could move the date of massive automation forward by just 10 years, say, from 30 years out to 20 years out, the economy would find it economically rational and justified to forfeit around 26% of flow consumption annually today.
26%.
To give you a concrete number, if you translate that to the current U.S. economy, where consumption is around $18.75 trillion annually.
Forfeiting 26% is equivalent to sacrificing roughly $4.7 trillion worth of consumption every single year.
Just to pull that massive automation date forward by a decade.
This illustrates the rational engine that is driving the willingness to invest trillions into overcoming these bottlenecks. The massive scale of the potential future payoff means that any current constraint,
Whether it's the $100 billion price tag for a power grid connection or the difficulty in scaling Kara's packaging.
it's just viewed as a temporary solvable cost barrier.
And this is where that theme comes in. The argument is, let AI burn it all down. Burn the capital, burn the energy, burn the political bridges, because the prize is orders of magnitude larger than the cost.
The economic justification exists for this hyper-aggressive investment. They will attempt to buy the chips, build the power plants, and scale the infrastructure because that future economic prize is unimaginably large.
The investment decision is hyper-rational, even at a cost of hundreds of billions per cluster.
Wow. Okay, so let's sum this up.
We started this deep dive by questioning whether the AI scaling train could continue running at its frenetic 4x a year pace.
And the analysis shows that technically, yes, it can. The target of 2E29 FLOP by 2030 is feasible, potentially leading to models that exceed GPT-4 in scale to the same degree GPT-4 exceeded GPT-2.
The bottlenecks are known: power, silicon, data, and latency.
And we learned the tightest limits are power and chip manufacturing. These are the logistical and physical walls that the industry must solve through massive capital expenditure.
Hundreds of billions of dollars for just one frontier cluster. And the cost of power alone will become 40% of the cost of the chips by 2030.
And the sources confirm that this level of investment isn't reckless. It is economically justified when you measure it against the enormous potential upside of automating significant portions of that global $60 trillion labor market.
It makes the willingness to sacrifice trillions in consumption today for future acceleration completely rational.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to take away.
The technical constraints, like the speed of light or the capacity of a wafer factory, are fixed by physics and logistics. But the true immediate barrier is economic willingness. And we've just seen the math supporting that willingness is extremely strong.
Given that investors are rationally willing to forego trillions in consumption today for future AI automation gains, the question shifts fundamentally.
The question is no longer can they physically build it, but can the political and regulatory environment keep pace with the hyper-aggressive economic drive to invest hundreds of billions in infrastructure?
What unexpected non-technical constraints like political resistance to 10-year transmission line projects, regulatory delays for new nuclear carbon-free power sources, or sudden political consensus demanding a carbon ceiling for AI training might prove to be the real walls holding back the industry. We might be bottlenecked by public policy long before we are ever bottlenecked by physics.